The autumn wind swept across the plains outside Cheyenne, rustling through the tall grass like whispered secrets. Dr. Henry Anderson stood at his cabin window, watching storm clouds gather on the horizon while organizing his medical supplies. 10 years of frontier medicine had taught him that bad weather always brought trouble, and tonight's restless sky promised no exception. His weathered hands moved methodically through rows of glass bottles and surgical tools, each one telling its own story of lives saved and lost on these unforgiving prairies. The sound of thundering hooves broke through the evening calm. Henry looked up to see a young Pawnee warrior on a paint horse, desperation etched across his face. Though the doctor had treated many natives over the years, building an unusual trust between himself and the local tribes, night visits were rare and never brought good news. The rider dismounted in a fluid motion, speaking rapidly in broken English about his chief's wife struggling with a difficult birth. Within minutes, Henry had his medical bag packed and was mounting his reliable mare, Martha. The warrior, who introduced himself as Charlie Walker, a name given to him by missionaries, led them north across the windswept prairie. The storm followed their path, distant lightning illuminating the way as they rode through gathering darkness. Henry's mind raced through possible complications, knowing that childbirth in these conditions could quickly turn deadly. The Pawnee camp appeared like a ghost town in the growing storm, with only a few fires still burning against the darkness. Outside the chief's lodge, a group of women huddled together, their worried faces illuminated by flickering flames. Inside, Henry found Susan, the chief's wife, fighting for her life. The baby was breech, and hours of labor had left her dangerously weak. The medicine woman, an elderly figure named Margaret, watched him with cautious respect as he began his work. Through the long night, Henry fought to save both mother and child. The storm raged outside, but inside the lodge, time seemed to stand still. He worked by lamplight, using every skill he'd learned in medical school and every lesson the frontier had taught him. Susan's strength amazed him. Even in her exhaustion, she remained silent and determined. The chief, who called himself Frank in English, stayed by her side, his stoic presence masking deep concern. As dawn approached, a new cry joined the subsiding storm. A healthy baby girl emerged into the world, and Susan's eyes filled with tears of joy and relief. The medicine woman, Margaret, nodded approvingly as Henry completed his work, ensuring both mother and child were stable. The chief's face softened with emotion as he held his daughter, then turned to Henry with profound gratitude. But what happened next would change the doctor's life forever. Frank spoke quietly about a sacred place, a spring hidden in the nearby mountains that held powerful healing properties. For generations, the Pawnee had protected its location from white settlers, using its waters to treat their sick. Now, as payment for saving his family, the chief offered to share this secret with Henry. However, his words carried a warning. Others were already searching for the spring, men with dangerous intentions. Before Henry could fully process this revelation, a commotion erupted outside. Robert Clark, a representative from the Taylor Pharmaceutical Company in Dodge City, had arrived with armed men. They'd been tracking native movements, convinced the tribes knew the location of the legendary healing spring. The company had already bought up water rights across the territory, and their pursuit of the spring had grown increasingly aggressive. Daniel Moore, Clark's lead enforcer, was a man Henry knew all too well. 5 years ago, Moore had killed Henry's brother in a disputed water rights claim, but the territorial court had cleared him of wrongdoing. Now, watching Moore's men surround the camp, Henry realized this was more than just a chance for revenge. It was a battle for the very soul of the frontier, where greed threatened to destroy something sacred. The chief's words echoed in Henry's mind as he stepped out of the lodge to face the intruders. The morning sun broke through the storm clouds, illuminating a scene that would spark a conflict unlike anything the territory had seen before. In saving one life, he had become entangled in a war that would test not just his courage, but his very understanding of justice and healing in this untamed land. Henry stood his ground as Moore's men fanned out across the meadow, their horses' hooves crushing the delicate prairie flowers that had helped him brew medicines for the past decade. The morning dew still clung to the tall grass, and somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark's song cut through the tension. He counted 12 riders, all armed, their Winchester rifles gleaming in the early light. Behind him, the Pawnee warriors moved silently into defensive positions, though they were outnumbered 2-1. The sacred spring bubbled quietly in its hollow, surrounded by the medicine lodges where Henry had learned so much from the tribe's healers. The thought of Clark Pharmaceuticals bottling and selling this water made his stomach turn. Frank Wilson, his oldest friend and the only other doctor within 100 miles, rode up from the direction of Cheyenne. He'd sent word 2 days ago when he'd first spotted Moore's men gathering. Frank's arrival meant that Martha, Henry's nurse, and the closest thing to family he had left, had successfully evacuated the sick from their small clinic to safer ground. "They've got papers from the territorial governor," Frank called out, dismounting near Henry. "Claim they have rights to survey any water source in the region. Moore's been spreading word in Deadwood that you're harboring hostiles and interfering with legitimate business." The accusations stung. Henry had spent years building trust between the settlers and the Pawnee, and Moore knew exactly how to poison that well. The chief's daughter, Rachel, who had trained alongside Henry in both Western medicine and tribal healing arts, stepped forward. "The spring has sustained our people for generations," she said in perfect English, her voice carrying across the meadow. "Its power comes from the earth itself, from the balance we maintain. You cannot bottle that and sell it in your cities." Moore dismounted, his spurs jingling with an almost theatrical flair. He'd grown more polished since the day he'd gunned down Henry's brother Robert, trading his Rough Rider gear for a businessman's suit. But the snake oil smile hadn't changed. "Dr. Crawford," he called out, using Henry's surname with mocking formality. "Surely a man of science understands progress. Clark Pharmaceuticals can help thousands with this water. Why waste it on superstition?" The wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of sage and coming rain. Henry thought of the chief's wife, how close she'd come to death before the spring's waters had helped her heal. He thought of all the patients, both native and settler, who'd found healing here. The spring wasn't just water. It was a bridge between worlds, a symbol of what the frontier could be if greed didn't poison it. "Your brother made the same choice," Moore continued, his hand resting casually on his holstered Colt. "He chose superstition over progress. Don't make his mistake." The threat hung in the air like gun smoke, but Henry saw something Moore didn't. Movement in the trees behind the pharmaceutical men. Charlie Two Hawks and his hunters had returned from their scout, and they weren't alone. Susan Parker, the widow who ran the trading post in Cheyenne, had always said Moore would bring war to these plains sooner or later. Now, as Henry watched her lead a group of settlers through the trees, ranchers and farmers who'd seen their water rights stripped away by Clark Pharmaceuticals, he realized this fight was bigger than just him or the spring. It was about the soul of the frontier itself, about whether the West would be ruled by greed or by something deeper, something that understood the true value of healing. The storm clouds gathered overhead, promising the kind of rain that could wash away old blood or spill new. Henry took a step forward, aware that every eye watched him, that his next words could spark a war or prevent one. The spring bubbled behind him, its ancient song a reminder of what was truly at stake. Henry raised his hands slowly, his doctor's fingers spreading wide in a gesture of peace. The morning light caught the silver threads in his dark hair, earned as much from worry as from his 40-odd years. Behind him, the spring's constant murmur seemed to grow quieter, as if nature itself held its breath for what would come next. "Mr. Clark," he called out to the pharmaceutical company's lead man, his voice carrying across the clearing. "These plains have seen enough blood. The spring isn't just a resource to be bottled and sold. It's a sacred trust, one that belongs to all people." He gestured to Charlie Two Hawks and the Pawnee hunters, then to Susan Parker and her settlers. United now, despite generations of mistrust, the company men shifted uneasily, their Winchester rifles catching the light. Frank Morrison, Clark's hired gun, spat into the grass and adjusted his grip on his weapon. His eyes never left Henry's face, recognizing him from their shared past in Dodge City, before Henry had chosen healing over hurting. Susan Parker stepped forward, her weathered face set with determination. "We've got signed documents from the territorial governor," she announced, pulling papers from her coat. "These waters are protected under the new conservation laws. Your purchase of the surrounding land doesn't give you rights to the spring itself." The wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of sage and coming rain. Charlie Two Hawks moved silently to Henry's side, his presence a reminder of the debt that had started all this. A successful childbirth on a stormy night, a sacred trust given in return. "The spirits of this place do not recognize paper laws," he said softly. but they know the difference between healing and greed. The spring sun cast long shadows across Dr. Henry Anderson's clinic in Cheyenne as he studied the mysterious map sketched on deerskin by Rachel Walking Cloud, the Pawnee chief's wife he'd helped through her difficult delivery just weeks before. The markings showed a hidden valley in the grasslands where, according to ancient tribal lore, a sacred spring bubbled up with remarkable healing properties. Henry traced the crude lines with his finger, remembering Rachel's words about how the waters had saved countless of her people over generations. Frank Taylor, the pharmaceutical company's lead researcher, had seemed reasonable enough during their first meeting in the clinic's cramped office. But there was something predatory in his eyes when Henry mentioned the spring's location, something that made the doctor's skin crawl. Now, watching mounted men from Taylor Pharmaceuticals patrol the outskirts of town with rifles across their saddles, Henry knew he'd said too much. The company man's facade of scientific interest had masked darker intentions. Margaret Clark, Henry's nurse and closest confidant, organized supplies in the background while listening to his troubled musings. "Those men Taylor brought aren't researchers or surveyors," she said quietly, rolling bandages with practiced efficiency. "I recognized one of them, Robert Moore. He used to ride with the Walker gang before they were run out of Deadwood. These are hired guns, plain and simple." Her words confirmed Henry's worst fears about Taylor's true motives. The situation had grown more complex with Charlie Walker's arrival in town. The grizzled rancher owned most of the grazing land between Cheyenne and the spring's supposed location, and he'd taken an immediate dislike to Taylor's presence. Walker had lost his wife Martha to consumption years ago, and rumors suggested he blamed pharmaceutical companies for pushing ineffective treatments that had only prolonged her suffering. His vendetta against Taylor seemed deeply personal. Daniel Clark, Margaret's brother and the local marshal, tried maintaining peace as tensions rose. But even his authority meant little to Taylor's men, who swaggered through town with open contempt for law and order. They'd already roughed up 2 Pawnee traders who'd come to town for supplies, sending a clear message about how they viewed native claims to the land. Henry knew it was only a matter of time before real violence erupted. The doctor found himself caught between competing interests, each with their own claim to the spring. The Pawnee viewed it as sacred heritage, Walker saw it as rightful ranching territory, and Taylor's company wanted to exploit it commercially. Henry's medical oath compelled him to preserve anything with true healing potential, but he also recognized how devastating unrestricted corporate development would be to both the land and its people. A letter arrived from Susan Anderson, Henry's sister in El Paso, warning him that Taylor's reputation for unscrupulous business practices was well known along the frontier. His company had already seized several mineral springs in Texas through dubious legal maneuvers, fencing them off and charging exorbitant prices for access. The pattern was clear. Taylor would stop at nothing to claim this new discovery for himself. Rachel's unexpected visit to the clinic under cover of darkness shifted everything. Her infant son strapped to her back, she told Henry that Taylor's men had been spotted near sacred Pawnee burial grounds, desecrating sites in their search for the spring. Her people were preparing for war, but she feared they would be massacred if they faced Taylor's well-armed forces directly. She begged Henry to help prevent bloodshed. The doctor formulated a daring plan. Using his respected position in the community, he would organize a diverse coalition of townspeople, ranchers, and Pawnee to resist Taylor's incursion through non-violent means. But he needed proof of the company's illegal activities to convince Marshal Clark to act. Margaret volunteered to gather evidence, leveraging her nursing duties to move freely through town without arousing suspicion. Laura Moore, Robert's estranged wife, proved an unexpected ally. She had left her husband years ago after witnessing his violent nature firsthand, and now worked as a schoolteacher in Cheyenne. Through her, they learned that Taylor had bribed several territorial officials and planned to file false mineral rights claims once the spring was found. The corruption went deeper than anyone had suspected. Henry's coalition grew stronger as more people recognized the threat Taylor posed to their way of life. Charlie Walker set aside his prejudices to coordinate with Pawnee scouts, using his intimate knowledge of the grasslands to monitor the company men's movements. The school children, led by Laura, began a letter-writing campaign to territorial authorities exposing Taylor's misdeeds. Even the local newspaper editor, despite intimidation, printed editorials questioning the company's methods. But Taylor would not be deterred easily. His men began burning homesteaders' barns and shooting cattle, trying to frighten the opposition into submission. When those tactics failed, they escalated to direct threats against Henry and his allies. The doctor knew time was running out. They needed to locate and protect the spring before Taylor's expedition found it. The future of the frontier hung in the balance, and the next move would determine everything. The prairie wind carried the scent of sage as Henry and Charlie crouched behind a limestone outcropping, watching Taylor's men set up camp in the valley below. Through his field glasses, Henry could make out at least 20 armed guards surrounding the expedition's wagons. The pharmaceutical company had spared no expense, bringing in professional gunmen from as far as Deadwood to protect their interests. Among them, Henry recognized the notorious Frank Miller, whose reputation for ruthless efficiency made him particularly dangerous. Charlie sketched a rough map in the dirt, marking the locations where Pawnee scouts had reported seeing Taylor's other search parties. The pattern was clear. They were methodically sweeping the grasslands in an expanding spiral from their base camp near Cheyenne. At their current pace, they would discover the sacred spring within days. Henry felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on him like a physical burden. The trust placed in him by the Pawnee chief couldn't be betrayed. Back at his clinic, Margaret helped Henry sort through his grandfather's old journals, searching for any clues about the spring's exact location. The elder doctor had treated natives and settlers alike for decades, recording their stories and folklore. As they pored over the yellowed pages by lamplight, Margaret's fingers traced a recurring symbol, a distinctive rock formation shaped like an eagle's head. Henry remembered seeing something similar on his rides with the Pawnee Scouts. The situation in town grew more tense with each passing day. Taylor's men swaggered through the streets, making sure everyone saw their guns. The saloon became a powder keg of resentment, with both sides trading dark looks over whiskey glasses. Laura's father closed the school after receiving anonymous threats, but the girl continued gathering signatures for her petition in secret. Her courage inspired others to stand firm despite the intimidation. Daniel, a young Pawnee warrior who had been studying medicine with Henry, arrived one night with urgent news. The tribe's elders had decided to perform the sacred ceremony that would officially recognize Henry as a keeper of the spring's secrets. Without this blessing, the spring's healing powers would remain dormant even if found. The ritual would take place at the next full moon, but Taylor's men were watching Henry's every move. Getting to the ceremonial grounds undetected would require all their cunning. Rachel, the telegraph operator, became their secret weapon. She intercepted messages between Taylor's search parties and redirected them with subtle changes, sending them on wild goose chases across the territory. Her small acts of sabotage bought precious time, though she knew discovery would mean losing her job, or worse. The quiet determination in her eyes reminded Henry of his late wife, who had always fought for what was right regardless of the cost. The breakthrough came when Susan, an elderly settler who had lived in the region for 40 years, recognized the eaglehead formation in Henry's grandfather's drawings. She remembered similar rocks near an old buffalo hunting ground, 3 days' ride to the north. But the area was now crawling with Taylor's men, and the full moon ceremony was less than a week away. They needed a diversion big enough to draw attention away from that sector without revealing their true objective. Charlie proposed a risky plan. He would drive his entire herd of cattle through Taylor's search grid, creating chaos and forcing the gunmen to protect the expedition's valuable horses and equipment. The company men wouldn't dare shoot at such expensive livestock, but the confusion would give Henry and his Pawnee guides the opening they needed. Martha, Charlie's wife, argued tearfully against risking their family's entire fortune, but Charlie knew some things were worth more than money. As preparations for both the cattle drive and the ceremony continued in secret, Henry found himself looking at his home with new eyes. The endless waves of grass rippling in the wind, the stark beauty of the buttes rising against the sky, the delicate balance of life that had existed here for countless generations. All of it was under threat from men who saw the land only as something to be exploited. The spring wasn't just a source of healing. It was a symbol of everything that made the frontier worth fighting for. Robert, the newspaper editor, published what might be his last editorial. Without naming names, he wrote about the choice between greed and harmony, between destruction and preservation. The piece ended with a quote from Henry's grandfather. "The land remembers who treats it with respect." The next morning, the printing press was found smashed to pieces, but copies of the paper had already spread throughout the territory, carrying its message to all who could read between the lines. The storm clouds gathered ominously over the plains as Dr. Henry Anderson crouched behind an overturned wagon, his medical bag clutched tightly against his chest. The armed men from Pharmalux Corporation had surrounded the sacred spring, their rifles trained on the small group of Pawnee warriors who refused to abandon their ancestral waters. Chief Standing Bear's wife Rachel stood resolute beside Henry, her newborn son wrapped tightly against her chest, a stark reminder of why the doctor had earned the tribe's trust just months before. Frank Taylor, the pharmaceutical company's lead enforcer, called out across the windswept grass. "Last chance, Doc. Sign over the mineral rights and walk away. Nobody needs to die here today." His words carried the hollow ring of a man who'd made similar threats many times before. Behind him, the setting sun cast long shadows across the faces of his hired guns, most of them former cattle rustlers from Dodge City who'd found more profitable work intimidating homesteaders. Henry's mind raced back to that stormy night when he'd first been led to the healing spring, after saving Rachel and her child through a difficult breech birth. The Pawnee had shared their sacred place with him not for profit, but because they recognized in him a healer's spirit. Now Pharmalux wanted to bottle and sell the mineral-rich waters, destroying a centuries-old legacy for quarterly profits. Daniel Moore, the local rancher who'd first alerted Henry to Pharmalux's plans, had positioned his best men in the hills overlooking the spring. They were good people, cowboys and farmhands who'd benefited from the spring's healing properties, and wouldn't stand by while corporate thugs seized it by force. But they were outnumbered nearly 2-1, and Frank Taylor's men were hardened killers. A sharp crack split the air as one of Taylor's men grew impatient and fired a warning shot. The bullet kicked up dirt near Rachel's feet, and she clutched her baby tighter but didn't flinch. Henry admired her courage. She'd already proven herself stronger than most during her harrowing labor. Now she was willing to die, to protect the waters that had sustained her people for generations. "You're making a mistake, Frank," Henry called out, trying one last time to reason with the man. "These waters can't be owned or bottled. Their power comes from the land itself, from the sacred trust between the people and the earth. The moment you try to possess them, they'll lose everything that makes them special." He knew his words wouldn't sway Taylor, but he had to try. The tension broke as riders appeared on the horizon. Charles Walker leading a group of Pawnee warriors who'd been gathering reinforcements from neighboring tribes. They thundered across the plains, war cries piercing the evening air. Taylor's men turned to face the new threat, momentarily distracted. It was the opening Henry and the others had been waiting for. Daniel Moore's ranchers opened fire from their hidden positions in the hills, forcing Taylor's men to scatter for cover. The spring itself seemed to pulse with energy as the battle erupted around it, its waters catching the last rays of sunlight like liquid fire. Henry pulled Rachel behind the relative safety of a large boulder, checking to ensure her baby remained unharmed. The fighting was brutal, but brief. The Pawnee warriors were superior horsemen, and Moore's ranchers knew every fold of the land. Taylor's hired guns, used to intimidating unarmed settlers, found themselves outmatched. Several threw down their weapons and fled into the gathering darkness. Others fought on with desperate fury, perhaps knowing their employer would show no mercy to those who failed him. Frank Taylor himself made a final, reckless charge toward the spring, perhaps thinking he could still claim some victory by destroying what he couldn't possess. Rachel saw his intention and stepped into his path, her child in one arm and her father's ancient knife in the other. The look in her eyes made even Taylor pull up short, his horse rearing in response to his sudden uncertainty. That moment of hesitation proved fatal for Taylor. A single shot from Charles Walker's rifle knocked him from his saddle. He fell into the spring itself, his blood mixing with the sacred waters. The remaining corporate gunmen, seeing their leader fall, threw down their weapons and surrendered. The battle for the healing spring was over, but Henry knew the war to protect it had only begun. As the adrenaline of combat faded, Henry moved among the wounded, treating friend and foe alike. Rachel assisted him, her medical knowledge passed down through generations proving as valuable as his formal training. Together they demonstrated the true power of the spring, not as a commodity to be exploited, but as a force for healing and unity between different peoples and ways of life. The victory came at a cost. 3 of Moore's ranchers and 2 Pawnee warriors had fallen in the fighting. They were buried near the spring in a ceremony that combined Christian and native traditions, their graves marked with both crosses and sacred totems. Their sacrifice would ensure the waters remained free for all who truly needed them, protected by an alliance stronger than any corporate contract. That night, as the survivors gathered around fires near the spring, Henry watched Rachel tend to her child while sharing stories with Moore's youngest daughter, Susan. Two women from vastly different worlds, united by their determination to protect something precious. He realized that perhaps this had been the spring's greatest gift, not its healing powers, but its ability to bring people together in defense of something greater than themselves. As dawn broke over the plains, Henry knew their victory at the spring would draw unwanted attention. Word would spread through Dodge City and beyond about the failed pharmaceutical expedition, and others would come seeking the spring's power. The alliance between the settlers and Pawnee would face greater tests in the days ahead. Rachel approached him as he stood watching the sunrise, her infant daughter wrapped snugly against her chest. "My people have discussed it," she said softly. "We believe the spring must be hidden, not just guarded, but made to disappear entirely." Henry turned to her, understanding dawning in his weathered features. The Pawnee had ancient methods of concealing sacred places, passed down through generations of medicine men. Frank Moore joined them, his cattle brand still visible on his dusty vest. "Whatever you're planning, count me in. My ranch and my riders will stand with you." The rancher had changed profoundly since the battle, seeing firsthand how the greed for the spring's power could corrupt men's souls. His daughter Susan stood beside him, her young face set with determination that matched her father's. Over the next 3 days, the Pawnee medicine men worked their ancient rituals while Henry and the ranchers labored to alter the landscape. They diverted small streams, planted native grasses, and used carefully placed rocks to change the spring's course beneath the earth. The sacred waters would still flow, but only those who truly understood their meaning would ever find them again. During their work, Henry noticed how Susan had taken to following Rachel, learning the Pawnee ways of gathering healing herbs and understanding the land's rhythms. The young rancher's daughter was bridging two worlds, just as the spring had brought together two peoples. It gave him hope for the future they were trying to protect. Martha, one of Moore's most experienced ranch hands, proved invaluable in coordinating the efforts to conceal the spring. Her knowledge of how water moved through the prairie helped them work with nature rather than against it. "Water finds its own path," she'd say, "just like truth finds its way to those who need it most." As their work neared completion, riders brought news from Cheyenne of more corporate interests assembling expeditions. But Henry smiled, knowing they would find nothing but prairie grass and limestone outcrops. The spring's power would remain, flowing secretly beneath their feet, accessible only to those who approached with pure hearts and genuine need. Charlie, the old Pawnee scout who had first guided Henry to the spring, performed the final blessing. His weathered hands scattered sacred herbs over the transformed landscape as he chanted in his native tongue. The words spoke of cycles of nature, of healing that comes not from possession but from understanding, of wisdom that flows like water through the generations. In the end, the spring disappeared so completely that even those who had helped hide it had trouble remembering its exact location. But that was the point. Its power was never meant to be mapped or measured, only felt by those who learned to listen to the land's ancient whispers. As their allies prepared to part ways, Henry watched Susan and Rachel embrace, the rancher's daughter now wearing a small Pawnee medicine pouch around her neck. Frank Moore shook hands with the tribal elders, a gesture that would have seemed impossible just weeks before. The spring had changed them all, teaching them that true healing came not from any magical water, but from the bonds forged in protecting something precious. Before returning to his practice in Dodge City, Henry made one final visit to the transformed landscape. Where the spring had once bubbled visibly, prairie flowers now swayed in the wind. But if he listened carefully, he could still hear the water flowing deep below, carrying its ancient wisdom through the earth. He understood now that some medicines couldn't be bottled and sold. They lived in the heart, in the land, and in the trust between peoples who chose to stand together. The pharmaceutical company's defeat marked not just the protection of a sacred spring, but the beginning of a new understanding between the settlers and the Pawnee. As Henry rode back toward town, he carried with him the knowledge that the greatest healing often comes not from what we gain, but from what we choose to protect together. The sun cast long shadows across the healing spring as Dr. Henry Anderson watched the armed men from Midwest Pharmaceuticals approach through his binoculars. Behind him, Charlie Moore of the Pawnee tribe readied his bow, while Daniel Clark checked his Winchester rifle, They had prepared for this confrontation for weeks, setting up defensive positions around the sacred waters that had saved so many lives. Margaret Taylor, the Pawnee chief's wife whose difficult childbirth had first brought Henry to the tribe, stood resolute beside her husband. The infant, now 3 months old, slept peacefully in a cradleboard nearby. Henry reflected on how that one night of desperate medical work had changed everything, forging an unbreakable bond between himself and the tribe who had trusted him with their most sacred secret. Frank Walker, the pharmaceutical company's lead enforcer, had already proven his ruthlessness by burning down Henry's clinic in Dodge City when the doctor refused to reveal the spring's location. Now he led 24 armed men toward the hidden valley, determined to claim the healing waters for his corporate masters. But the defenders had advantages Frank couldn't imagine. The Pawnee warriors had spent generations protecting this place, and they'd taught Henry and Daniel how to use the terrain. Narrow passes were rigged with deadfalls, false trails led to quicksand pits, and the approach to the spring itself was a natural killing ground where a few defenders could hold off many attackers. Still, Henry hoped it wouldn't come to bloodshed. Rachel Moore, Charlie's wife and the tribe's most skilled healer, had shown Henry how the spring's waters could be rendered temporarily inert through a special ceremony. If violence erupted, they would perform the ritual, making the spring worthless to the company until the next moon cycle. The corporate men were racing against time without even knowing it. The first shots came at dusk, echoing off the valley walls as Frank's men tried to flush out the defenders. But the Pawnee warriors were masters of stealth, and Henry had learned well from them. The attackers' wild firing only revealed their own positions while the defenders remained hidden in shadow and brush. Through the night, the corporate gunmen grew increasingly frustrated as their quarry seemed to melt away before them. Several men were injured by clever traps, while others simply disappeared into the darkness, taken silently by Pawnee warriors who moved like ghosts. Frank Walker's confident assault was becoming a nightmare of confusion and fear. Dawn revealed the extent of the attackers' demoralization. Nearly half had fled during the night, leaving their equipment behind. Those who remained were jumpy and exhausted, jumping at shadows. Henry watched through his binoculars as Frank raged at his men, striking one who suggested retreat. The doctor felt no satisfaction in the violence, only sadness at its necessity. The turning point came when Laura Clark, Daniel's wife and the local schoolteacher, arrived with the federal marshal from Dodge City. She had ridden through the night with documentation proving the spring lay on protected tribal lands. The marshal's presence changed everything. Frank's remaining men quickly surrendered rather than face federal charges. But Frank Walker, consumed by fury and greed, made one final desperate attempt. He threw a stick of dynamite toward the spring itself, hoping to destroy what he couldn't possess. Charlie Moore's arrow took him in the shoulder while Henry tackled the explosive, hurling it into a deep ravine where it detonated harmlessly. The aftermath brought unexpected healing. The captured corporate men, treated with compassion by those they'd come to attack, began to understand the true value of the sacred place. Many renounced their mission, some even choosing to stay and learn from the tribe. The spring's powers, it seemed, worked in mysterious ways. Susan Anderson, Henry's wife who had supported his decision to protect the spring despite the danger to their family, helped Rachel Moore establish new protocols for sharing the water's healing properties. Together, they found ways to help those truly in need while preserving the spring's sanctity and secrecy. As summer faded to autumn, the valley settled into a new rhythm. The pharmaceutical company, its schemes exposed, faced federal investigation. The tribe welcomed new allies while maintaining their protective role. And Henry Anderson discovered that his true calling wasn't just healing bodies, but helping bridge the divide between two worlds that had much to learn from each other. Martha Walker, Frank's estranged sister, who had long opposed his ruthless methods, became an unexpected ally. Her testimony helped prosecute the corporate conspirators while protecting the spring's location. She found her own healing in the process, welcomed by both the tribe and the frontier community as she worked to right her brother's wrongs. The legacy of those tense days lived on in stories told around campfires and in quiet lessons passed down through generations. The spring remained a sacred secret, its waters flowing pure and powerful, protected by an alliance forged in crisis and strengthened by understanding. Henry often visited the site with his grandchildren, teaching them that true healing came not just from magical waters, but from the wisdom to use such gifts wisely. Years after the conflict over the healing spring, the plains around Cheyenne transformed in subtle ways that only the most observant could detect. New partnerships between the Pawnee healers and frontier doctors led to remarkable advances in medicine, though the spring itself remained carefully hidden. Henry Anderson's clinic became a place where traditional and native healing practices merged, drawing people from as far as Deadwood seeking cures that combined the best of both worlds. The pharmaceutical company's defeat had broader implications than anyone initially realized. Other corporations began approaching tribal lands with more respect and consideration, leading to sustainable agreements that benefited both sides. Frank Walker's former associates found themselves increasingly isolated as public sentiment turned against their exploitative methods. The frontier was changing, and the old ways of taking what one wanted by force were giving way to more thoughtful approaches. Martha Walker's redemption story became legendary among both settlers and natives. She established a school near Dodge City where Pawnee healing traditions were taught alongside modern medicine, ensuring the ancient knowledge wouldn't be lost. The school attracted students from both cultures, creating bonds that would last generations. Henry often lectured there, sharing his experiences while carefully protecting the spring's secrets. Charlie, the Pawnee chief whose wife and child had been saved, became an influential voice for cooperation between cultures. His son, now growing into a strong young man, embodied the hope of two worlds coming together. The boy learned both the ancient ways of his people and the new medicine Henry practiced, preparing to bridge the divide just as his birth had done years before. The spring's protection evolved into a sophisticated network of tribal guardians and trusted settlers. They developed subtle ways to divert attention from the sacred site while ensuring its waters remained available to those truly in need. Rachel, who had initially helped Henry during the crisis, became one of the most respected members of this protective alliance, her quiet strength a testament to the power of unity. Daniel and Robert, two ranchers who had stood with Henry during the confrontation, found their cattle operations prospering as they embraced more cooperative relationships with their Pawnee neighbors. Their ranges became models of how the old and new ways could work together, with traditional grazing patterns respecting both the land and tribal territories. Their success inspired other ranchers to follow suit. Laura, Henry's wife, documented the healing traditions in a series of coded journals, ensuring the knowledge would survive while protecting its secrets. She worked closely with Pawnee women, learning their ways of using local plants and combining them with her own medical knowledge. The resulting treatments proved remarkably effective, drawing quiet attention from medical societies back east. The spring itself seemed to respond to this harmonious stewardship. Its waters remained pure and powerful, but those who knew its location noticed that it appeared to flourish under the combined care of both cultures. Native ceremonies and modern conservation methods worked together to preserve not just the water, but the delicate ecosystem surrounding it. Margaret, who had helped tend to the chief's wife during her difficult delivery, established a midwifery practice that became famous throughout the territory. She trained both native and settler women in combined techniques that significantly reduced complications during childbirth. Her work helped heal old wounds between communities while saving countless lives. Susan, whose family had long distrusted the Pawnee, became one of the strongest advocates for cooperation after witnessing the spring's power firsthand. She organized regular gatherings where women from both communities could share knowledge and stories, building understanding that went far beyond medicine. These meetings became a cornerstone of regional peace. As the years passed, the legend of the healing spring took on new dimensions. It became not just a story about magical waters, but a symbol of what could be achieved when people chose understanding over conflict. Henry's grandchildren grew up in a frontier that, while still wild and challenging, had learned valuable lessons about respect and cooperation. They carried these lessons forward, ensuring that the spring's true legacy would continue to flow through generations. The transformation of the frontier around Cheyenne stood as a testament to the power of choices made in moments of crisis. The spring remained hidden, but its influence rippled outward in countless ways, touching lives far beyond those who knew its location. It became a reminder that the most powerful healing often came not from any single source, but from the wisdom to recognize and protect the gifts that brought people together.